Good evening, and let's begin by situating ourselves very carefully in this moment. The setting is the World Economic Forum in Davos, a gathering designed for global leaders, policymakers, business executives, and diplomats to discuss the most pressing issues facing the world. It is a place known for panels, side meetings, carefully prepared remarks, and conversations that often compete for attention. And yet, in this particular moment, much of that expected rhythm was interrupted, because Donald Trump arrived in Davos and directed his attention very clearly and very forcefully toward America's NATO allies. He criticized them sharply over defense spending, not in passing, not as a secondary point, but as a central message that quickly began to dominate the atmosphere around the forum. You could feel it, the way conversations pivoted, the way questions changed. The way other topics, carefully scheduled and long anticipated, suddenly found themselves pushed aside. Trump's remarks did not exist in isolation. They landed in a context already made tense by the issue of Greenland's sovereignty. That issue, hovering in the background, suddenly moved to the foreground. It overshadowed other Davos discussions almost immediately, and in doing so, it redirected global attention. This was not a subtle shift. It was visible, it was immediate, and it mattered, because Davos is not just a conference, it is a signal. It is a place where priorities are inferred not only from what is said, but from what is drowned out. And in this case, what was drowned out were many of the traditional Davos themes: climate, trade, economic cooperation. Those conversations did not disappear, but they were no longer leading the day. Instead, the focus narrowed. NATO allies, defense spending, and the unresolved sensitive question of Greenland. One participant described the feeling succinctly. This is where the room went quiet, and you can imagine why. Trump's criticism of NATO allies touched a long-standing fault line within the alliance. Defense spending has been a point of tension for years, but here at Davos, the criticism was not buffered by closed-door diplomacy. It was aired openly, publicly, on a global stage, and that changed how it landed. The remarks did not merely register as a policy position, they registered as a disruption. They reframed the narrative of the forum itself. Instead of Davos shaping the conversation reshaped Davos. You know, Davos often operates on a kind of controlled chaos, multiple conversations happening at once. But this was different. This was a convergence. A single set of remarks pulling attention toward one axis. Trump's focus on NATO allies' defense spending raised immediate questions among attendees, not questions about numbers or percentages, but questions about unity, about expectations, about the tone of alliance politics going forward. At the same time, the Greenland sovereignty issue lingered. It did not require elaboration to dominate. Its mere presence in the discourse was enough to remind everyone that this was not a routine policy disagreement. This was about territory, about sovereignty, about boundaries that are not theoretical. And so, as Trump spoke, these threads intertwined. NATO, defense obligations, Greenland. And suddenly, Davos was no longer about what it had planned to be about. It was about tension, about strain, about the visible cracks within an alliance that has long presented itself as unified. There was no dramatic announcement, no formal declaration, just remarks. But remarks can be powerful. They can reorder attention, they can crowd out other voices, and in this case, they did. One attendee put it quietly. Everything else felt smaller after that. The forum continued, of course. Panels went on, meetings were held, but the shadow remained. The sense that something fundamental had been surfaced, not resolved, not smoothed over, just surfaced. And once surfaced, impossible to ignore. This is how the opening moments unfolded, not with spectacle, but with a shift, a narrowing of focus, and a reminder that words spoken in the right place can change the shape of an entire gathering. As the forum moved forward, the shift that began with those remarks did not fade. It settled in. It became the lens through which everything else was viewed. At Davos, where global coordination is often the unspoken goal, Trump's criticism of NATO allies for defense spending lingered like an unresolved note. People kept returning to it, in hallways, inside conversations, in the framing of questions during unrelated panels. The issue was not just what was said, it was where it was said. Davos is designed to project stability, to suggest that even disagreement happens within a shared framework. And here, that framework felt strained. Trump's remarks underscored long-standing disagreements within NATO, but they did so without cushioning language. They were direct. They were unmistakable. And because they were delivered in this setting, they took on added weight. There was no effort in that moment to rebalance the message. No parallel emphasis on unity. No softening refrains. That absence mattered. The Greenland sovereignty issue amplified this effect. It hovered over discussions not as a discrete policy debate, but as a symbol. A reminder that questions of territory and authority are not abstract, they are concrete. And when paired with criticism of NATO allies, the symbolism became harder to ignore. Participants understood that this combination shifted attention away from other priorities. That was not speculative, it was observable. Panels scheduled to focus on economic cooperation found themselves fielding questions about alliance cohesion. Discussions about future growth were reframed by concerns about geopolitical friction. The agenda was still printed, but the conversation had moved. One diplomat described the atmosphere in understated terms. It changed the temperature. That temperature change reflected more than discomfort. It reflected uncertainty. NATO, as an alliance, rests on shared commitments. Defense spending is one of those commitments. And criticism of that commitment, delivered publicly, inevitably raises questions, not about intent, not about future actions, but about trust. The forum did not produce answers to those questions. That was never its function. What it did produce was visibility. Visibility into tensions that are often managed behind closed doors. Here they were out in the open. And once visible, they influenced everything else. The Greenland issue in particular resisted simplification. It did not require explanation to draw attention. Its presence alone redirected focus. Because sovereignty is not negotiable language, it carries historical weight, legal implications, and emotional resonance. Combined with criticism of NATO allies, it framed the conversation in terms of strain rather than cooperation. This was evident in the way global attention shifted. Media coverage narrowed, headlines condensed. Instead of a wide array of Davos themes, the spotlight fixed on these remarks. Trump's statements became the reference point. Other discussions were measured against them, not because they were louder, but because they were disruptive. At Davos, disruption is rare. The event thrives on predictability, on carefully choreographed exchanges. This moment disrupted that choreography. It introduced an unscripted element, and unscripted elements draw focus. Attendees responded in different ways. Some leaned into the discussion, acknowledging the tensions openly. Others attempted to redirect conversations back to economic issues. But even those attempts revealed the underlying shift. You cannot redirect attention unless it has already moved, and it had. The criticism of NATO allies also highlighted the depth of existing divisions. Defense spending has long been uneven among alliance members. That is a known fact. What changed here was the framing. Delivered at Davos, the critique was not contained within military or diplomatic channels. It entered the broader public discourse of the forum. That expanded its reach. It made it harder to compartmentalize, and that, in turn, made it harder to ignore. The Greenland sovereignty issue functioned almost like an echo. It reinforced the seriousness of the moment, not through escalation, but through association. Together, these topics suggested a shift away from consensus-driven messaging. They suggested friction, and friction, once introduced, alters momentum. There was a quiet acknowledgement among participants that other topics were losing oxygen: climate initiatives, trade negotiations, technological innovation. These conversations continued, but with less prominence. They no longer defined the event. Instead, they existed alongside a dominant narrative of alliance tension. One attendee summed it up in a sentence that traveled quickly through the halls. "This wasn't what we came here to talk about." And yet, it was what everyone was talking about. That dissonance captured the essence of the moment. Davos did not plan for this focus, but it adapted to it. And in that adaptation, the forum revealed its sensitivity to geopolitical signals. Trump's remarks did not resolve anything. They did not announce a policy shift. They did not formalize a position, but they reoriented attention. They reminded everyone present that alliances are not static, that they are subject to pressure, and that public criticism, especially in a global setting, carries consequences for perception. As the days progressed, the initial remarks continued to ripple, not dramatically, not explosively, but persistently. Each reference reinforced the central theme: NATO, defense spending, Greenland. The forum's rhythm adjusted accordingly. This was not a crisis moment. It was a revealing one, a moment that showed how quickly the focus of global discussion can change, and how words, placed carefully or not, can become the gravitational center of an event designed to be about many things at once. A quiet reflection captured the mood. When one thing takes over, everything else has to make room. By the end of this phase of the forum, it was clear that the narrative had been reshaped, not concluded, not resolved, but reshaped. And that reshaping set the stage for how the forum would be remembered, not for what it planned to emphasize, but for what it could not escape. As Davos approached its close, the conversations did not abruptly reset. They rarely do. Instead, what lingered was the imprint left by those remarks and the way they reordered attention. By the final sessions, it was clear that the forum would not be remembered primarily for its original agenda. It would be remembered for how quickly that agenda was overtaken. The criticism of NATO allies for defense spending had done more than spark debate. It had established a reference point, a marker against which the rest of the forum was measured. Participants spoke about other issues, yes, but they did so in the shadow of that earlier disruption. The Greenland sovereignty issue remained part of that shadow. It did not evolve into a separate track of discussion. It did not require escalation to remain present. Its very mention carried enough weight to sustain attention. Together, these elements framed Davos as a forum grappling with visible alliance tension, not hypothetically, not in abstract terms, but in real time. And that framing mattered, because Davos functions in many ways as a signal to the rest of the world. What dominates Davos often signals what will dominate global conversation in the weeks that follow. In this case, the signal was unmistakable. The focus had narrowed to questions of alliance, cohesion, and responsibility. Trump's remarks were not revisited in formal statements. They did not become a recurring talking point from the main stage. But they did not need to. Their impact was already embedded. They had reshaped expectations. They had reframed discussions. And they had altered how participants interpreted one another's words. In quieter moments, attendees acknowledged this shift, not with alarm, but with recognition. Davos is accustomed to disagreement. What stood out here was the way disagreement had asserted itself, publicly, directly, without the usual buffers. The criticism of NATO allies highlighted differences that are often managed through diplomacy rather than display. Here they were displayed. And once displayed, they influenced tone. Tone in a forum like this is everything. The Greenland issue reinforced that tone. It reminded participants that geopolitical questions are not confined to budgets or percentages. They involve land, sovereignty, identity. Those themes do not fade easily. As the forum wound down, media summaries reflected this recalibration. Coverage emphasized alliance tension. It emphasized the way Trump's presence and remarks had redirected attention. Other topics were mentioned, but they were no longer central. The hierarchy of issues had been reordered, not by consensus, but by disruption. This did not mean that Davos failed. It meant that Davos revealed something. It revealed how sensitive global discourse is to moments of friction, how quickly carefully planned agendas can be overtaken by unscripted remarks, and how alliances, even long-standing ones, remain subject to public strain. Participants departed with that understanding, not with conclusions, not with resolutions, but with awareness. Awareness that the forum had served as a mirror rather than a map. It reflected tensions rather than charting solutions. That reflection was, for many, the most significant outcome. One senior attendee offered a quiet observation as the event concluded. This is what people will remember. That memory is not about policy detail. It is not about numerical targets or formal agreements. It is about focus, about how attention moved, about how a single set of remarks can dominate a global gathering. The criticism of NATO allies and the overshadowing Greenland issue did not produce immediate change. They did not resolve disputes. But they clarified something important. They clarified that unity, when questioned publicly, becomes the central issue. Everything else adjusts around it. As the final sessions ended and participants began to leave Davos, the forum returned to its familiar rhythm of departures and debriefs. But the imprint remained, not as a dramatic turning point, but as a marker, a reminder of how fragile consensus can appear when placed under a global spotlight. In that sense, the forum accomplished something unintended but revealing. It showed in real time how global attention consolidates, how quickly it narrows, and how difficult it is to redirect once it has settled. The closing moments of Davos were calm, routine, but beneath that calm was a recognition that the narrative had already been written, not by planners, not by panels, but by the convergence of criticism, sovereignty, and setting. A final thought, offered without emphasis, seemed to capture it best. Once the focus shifts, it doesn't just shift back. And with that, the forum concluded, not with answers, but with clarity about what had taken center stage and why.